Thank you, and thank you. I'd like to thank the UMD for inviting me here to Skopje to present this paper thesis. Hang on, can I just go back on this? Can I go back? I jumped ahead. Sorry. All right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So this. Well, I say my wider research covers the whole of pre-communist Yugoslavia and its sort of development, and how that development affected British public perceptions of the Balkan region as often of the Balkan region at the time. However, this particular section is a sort of case study I look at, and we'll be looking at towards the end of my second chapter of my thesis eventually. Okay, so across the vast spectrum of research that has analysed and reanalyzed British diplomacy in the late 19th and early 20th century, the Eastern question, later becoming interchangeable with the Macedonian question, has attracted particular notoriety. The prolonged implosion of the Ottoman Empire's 5-century rule in the Balkans presented the great powers of a key dilemma in maintaining a balance of power ill-prepared for an ever-changing international context. The majority of accounts tend to be saturated with diplomacy and high politics, whilst Macedonia and the wider region only briefly feature as part of a general narrative. Moving into the 20th century, the wars of 1912 to 13 are commonly defined as preludes to the First World War. Richard Hall even argues that whilst the Treaty of Bucharest officially drew the fighting in Macedonia to a close, it continued in Albania up to July 1914, effectively linking the two conflicts together. In this context, Macedonia in the early 20th century was rarely viewed as anything other than a piece of Orthodox Christian irredentia that seemed to propagate one crisis after another. Within Britain, the Macedonian question was subject to three viewpoints: a traditional high political and diplomatic narrative that viewed the region in terms of great power relations has attracted the most focus from historians. This, however, ran parallel to two other sets of viewpoints. One consisted of a varied body of academic and journalistic opinion, often stemming from those who held direct experience of travelling through Macedonia and the Balkans at the time, and the other was popular views and perceptions of the region amongst the majority of the British public. These three viewpoints were far from mutually exclusive. By the turn of the century in particular, the second had emerged to rapidly shape the views of the other two. Formed in July 1903, the Balkan Committee was its principal vehicle. Alongside regional experts, its membership included various high-profile political, religious and cultural figures, including the then Home Secretary Herbert Gladstone and the future Labour Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald. Whilst never exerting direct influence on British foreign policy vis-à-vis the Balkans, the committee's work was crucial in changing its tone and the shaping of public opinion that could be brought to bear on the government. This, however, must be viewed in the general context of the time. Lying outside the British imperial sphere, the Balkans never really rose beyond a peripheral interest in the minds of most Britons for any sustained period. Attitudes towards it thus crystallised around specific Balkan medians, such as violence and intrigue. These perceptions were often reinforced by so-called experts. Following the Napoleonic Wars, exaggerated fears of an Ottoman collapse and an expansionist Russia had dominated the thinking of the Foreign Office. With Russia gaining access to the Eastern Mediterranean and control over the Black Sea and the Dardanelles, British India would be imperiled, so the argument ran. As a result, a policy of containment based around the shoring up of the sick man of Europe had been rigidly pursued, most notably through intervention in the Crimean War. However, growing frustration over the port's failure at administrative reform, concerns over its debt repayments, public outrage over reports of the mistreatment of its Christian subjects, and the rise of Wilhelmine Germany had been factors in its abandonment towards the end of the 19th century. By 1912, it had been replaced with the cautious favouring of for the creation of new autonomous states or the carefully managed expansion of the independent Balkan monarchies. However, Britain's role and level of influence have often been overstated by historians. Attempts to encourage reform within what, by 1903, were termed the Macedonian Vilayets proved fruitless. Growing concerns over Berlin's influence in Constantinople prompted the then Foreign Secretary Lord Lansdowne to push for radical reforms in both 1904 and 1905. Amongst his recommendations were the creation of a single autonomous Macedonian province and the appointment of a foreign inspector general over whom the Sultan would have had nominal authority. Unsurprisingly, these proposals were promptly rejected by the other European powers, whilst raising little enthusiasm within Lansdowne's own government. Plans by his successor, Sir Edward Grey, to reopen the issue of autonomy at the end of 1907 and the beginning of 1908 were also thwarted by the outbreak of the Young Turk Uprising. Outside of this political sphere, the name Macedonia was more likely to be associated with Alexander the Great than the contemporary situation. Before the 1870s, British travellers were mostly inclined to frame their experiences through the scope of antiquity. Whilst en route to Egypt in the early 17th century, the writer Henry Blount used Greek mythology in the Battle of Thermopylae to convey where Macedonia's boundaries were supposed to lie. By virtue of this historic link, Macedonia and other Hellenic regions could be set apart from the orientalized remainder of the Ottomans' European possessions. However, this notion of a Turkey in Europe and the Oriental other was not necessarily defined by geographical proximity to Anatolia. The archaeologist Arthur Evans, having argued that having embraced Turkish rule, Bosnia-Herzegovina had emerged within the empire as the chosen land of Mohammedan conservatism and the lion that guards the gates of Istanbul. Those acquainted with the sites and culture of North Africa or Asia would find such features comfortably reciprocated within 5 minutes of crossing the Bosnian frontier, according to Evans. In contrast, Macedonia, Thrace, the Aegean, and even, quote, Istanbul itself had lost or even displayed many Oriental customs and costumes, unquote. This interpretation of Macedonian cultural distinctiveness was, however, being challenged by the turn of the century. In an illustration of an Orthodox priest's house by the anthropologist Mary Edith Durham, dated to 1905, the priest and his two guests are depicted sitting cross-legged on a raised cushion-strewn dais. As in many Albanian or Bosnian households, an Islamic-styled rug hangs on the wall, whilst light is provided by a Turkish lantern. Only the ornate crucifix, the priest's cassock, and a bottle of what Durham claims to be rakia indicate that the figures are in fact Christians. Throughout the second half of the 19th and early 20th centuries, travellers to the region attempted to disseminate information on Macedonia to the British public, as well as influence perceptions of varying degrees of success. The Ottoman system of classification, based on religion rather than ethnicity, for example, tended to label all Christians as Greeks and all Muslims as Turks, and was often never clarified by those who subsequently wrote accounts of their travels. Overlapping cultural and linguistic traits amongst the various ethnicities further add to this general confusion. Describing an overland journey that had passed through Montenegro, Albania and Macedonia in the 1840s, one former traveller recounted how the various peoples he had encountered seemed to be part of the same race due to linguistic similarities. The notion of the South Slavs as a distinct group, as a group distinct from Greeks, Illyrians or Turks was not introduced into mainstream public consciousness until the 1860s. The two women travellers, Georgina Mackenzie and Adeline Irby, who, according to Maria Todorova, effectively, quote, discovered the South Slavs for the English public, unquote, had done so from a starting supposition that, quote, vaguely supposed all the lands of the Balkans to be inhabited by Greeks and Turks, unquote. The notion of an existing or nascent Macedonian identity as anything more than a provisional subsidiary of its Orthodox Christian neighbours barely entered the considerations of ardent observers, let alone the general public. Whilst numerous Sions, Bulgarian, Greek and Serbian intelligentsias resided in London and other European capitals during the 19th century, virtually no contact existed with their Macedonian equivalent. The fact that many who defined themselves as Macedonian nationalists held Bulgarian citizenship further complicated this matter and reinforced popular perceptions of the Slavic Macedonian identity being reciprocal to the Bulgarian one. Quote, let me begin by correcting an almost universal fallacy, stated Evans in 1903. There are no Macedonians, unquote. A similar dichotomy existed in regards to cultural exposure and exchange. English translations of Serbian poetry and folklore, for example, were being published as early as the 1820s. In contrast, works such as George Polevsky's Rečnik od tri jezika remained unknown, whilst an English translation of Krst Mizirskov's On Macedonian Matters didn't appear until 1974. Published in 1903, the Macedonian folklore was one of the few cultural or anthropological works to specifically focus on Macedonia itself. The potential contrarian ethos presented by the title is, however, misleading. As a Greek scholar, the author, George Frederick Abbott, limited his work exclusively to Macedonia's southern and southwestern portion, with almost all his findings gathered from Greek Macedonians. Occasionally chancing by Abbott upon shared cultural and linguistic traits amongst Greek and Slav communities were never explored in any great depth, and were exclusively portrayed as arising from a fundamentally Greek cultural context. Macedonia only emerged as a modern geo and ethnographic concept within mainstream public attention during the Eastern Crisis of 1875 to 78, and its return to Ottoman control under the Treaty of Berlin. Reports of Ottoman atrocities in Bulgaria and Herzegovina mobilized public opinion against the terrible Turk and hardened attitudes against the pro-Ottoman policy advocated by successive conservative governments. Wars of liberation modelled on a Byronic ideal of the Greek War of Independence were pushed by pro-Serb, Bulgarian and Greek factions within Britain as the only means of removing the Turkish yoke. The role of the Balkan Committee was central in formulating this new mood, fueled by a combination of 19th century liberal nation-state philosophy and emancipatory ideals. These were juxtaposed with conceptions of Ottoman and Asian rule as lazy, corrupt, stagnant and inherently inferior. However, whilst wars of liberation were deemed necessary, the acts of violence instigated towards this end largely generated antipathy, particularly in regards to the various comitadi bands. Whilst receiving a degree of praise and admiration from some quarters, they were ultimately regarded as signifying the moral malaise afflicting the peninsula, with murder and Byzantine intrigue standing in the place of European law and order. The kidnapping of the American Protestant missionary Miss Ellen Marie Stone by the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization 1901 had drawn particular attention at the beginning of the century. 6 years later, a British national called Martin Wells also claimed to have been held to ransom by the IMRO or an affiliate whilst working for a Turkish tobacco company. Whilst in captivity, Wills claimed that he had been tortured, mutilated and deliberately starved. Opening his account, he attributed the British public's then pro-Bulgarian leanings to a skillful campaign by propagandists in both Bulgaria and Britain and by the Bulgarian Exarchate in Macedonia as a covert means of enhancing Bulgarian state power. Such was the depth of this conspiracy, according to Wills, that armed bands were even being directly led by Bulgarian military officers who, in many cases, hadn't even bothered to discard their uniforms whilst raiding villages. Although both events were unrelated, the murders of King Alexander and Queen Draga Obrenović of Serbia and the Ilinden uprising in 1903 were often linked together as symptoms of this Balkan predicament predilection for violence. In his account of the regicide, the writer Herbert Vivian dedicated an entire chapter to the subject of brigandage in order to demonstrate how the murders were one aspect of a broader problem. To illustrate his point, Vivian chose this particular image. An absence of any notion of civilization and centuries of moral decay under the neglect that passed for Turkish rule had made Macedonia, in Vivian's words, the headquarters of all brigandage. Despite having served as head of an emergency Macedonian relief fund following the uprising, the journalist H.N. Brailsford gloomily stated that he saw little hope for Macedonia in its current state without some form of external intervention. Quote, "I have tried so far as a European can to judge both Christians and Turks as tolerantly as possible, remembering divergence that exists between the standards of the Balkans and of Europe. In the land where the peasant ploughs with a rifle on his back, where the rulers govern by virtue of their ability to massacre upon occasion, where Christian bishops are commonly supposed to organize political murders, life has but a relative guilt. There is little to choose in bloody mindedness between any of the Balkan races. They are all of what centuries of Asiatic rule have made them." Whilst few non-official voices from the region were on hand to dispute such arguments, those that were often reflected an awareness of their region's image in the wider world. During her travels, Durham offered a rare glimpse into a Balkan perspective. Quote, "You think in England you are civilized and you can teach us. I tell you there is no one here that would commit crimes as are found in London. Our brigands are poor men. By working hard in the fields, they can only just live. They are quite ignorant and have never been to any school. They rob to live and do so at the risk of their lives. But your brigands have often been to university and robbed to obtain luxuries by lies and false promises." The Albanian populace were often the target of this criticism, being routinely singled out as one children's author put it, pets of the Sultan who pampers and fears them. The evident anti-Muslim and ethnic prejudice on which the majority view of the Macedonian question was based proved a sharp point of contention even before the Balkan Wars, as Durham also observed. When a Muslim kills a Muslim, it does not count. When a Christian kills a Muslim, it is a righteous act. When a Christian kills a Christian, it is an error of judgment better not talked about. It is only when a Muslim kills a Christian that we arrive at a full-blown international atrocity. Despite the effects of the committee's members, the initial intensity of this public outrage over the repression of Macedonia's Christian populace proved impossible to maintain. Nearly a decade of announcements in the press that a war would begin at the following spring generated a pre-war weariness amongst those for whom the Balkans were little more than a passing peripheral interest. The formerly ominous maxim, "trouble in the Balkans," soon began to convey exacerbation or sarcasm rather than anxiousness. By the eve of the First Balkan War, over 2 decades of naysaying and tidings of doom from diplomats and foreign office ministers over the international consequences of the Eastern question had begun to diminish its perceived urgency. Austria-Hungary's annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1908, for example, was largely received with public indifference. Responding to a complaint by a Foreign Office minister, the Times Foreign Affairs editor, Valentin Chira, informed him that voicing his concerns were futile. Quote, "In general, people are, I think, sick to death of this in this country of the Near Eastern crisis, for few of them understand it, and still fewer, of course, realise that behind it lies the much bigger question of the balance of power in Europe." By 1912, the Times was the only British newspaper to still maintain a full-time correspondent in a Balkan capital. Other titles simply relied on those based in Vienna, Constantinople, Rome, Berlin, or St. Petersburg to provide coverage, often for the whole of Eastern and Central Europe. Within this context of public disengagement, ongoing attempts by their respective ethnic group, and an inactive government nervous over the prospect of any sudden change, the outbreak of the Balkan Wars themselves brought the mixed feelings that had developed towards Macedonia and the Balkans to a head twice. As Eugen Mikhail argues, whilst the broader historical narrative characterizes both wars as being two acts in the same play, each produced opposite reactions abroad. The initial response had been enthusiastic, with the Balkan League's campaigns in 1912 being interpreted as the culmination of the anti-Ottoman liberationist wars of the 19th century. The end of Ottoman rule in Albania, Macedonia, and Thrace were the final steps in bringing the Balkans out of the Orient and into Europe. However, when the first 2 weeks of the war, concerns were already being raised over the number of refugees and accusations of atrocities being committed in both Albania and Macedonia. However, these were initially dismissed, ignored, or argued down. Quote, "Better an end with horrors than horrors without an end," ran an article in The Nation. I'll skip over that bit. This popular mood of enthusiasm was, however, reversed with the outbreak of the second war. As jubilation over the League's crusade was replaced by a bitter sense of betrayal. Summarizing this change in attitude, the diplomat George Young noted in 1915 that Western Europeans, quote, "had made fools of themselves," unquote, by considering the Balkans to be part of Europe. A key feature during the First War and much of the Second was the initially tight control of information by both sides. One British journalist who had been stationed with the Ottoman army claimed that during the war he and a colleague based with the Bulgarians had been treated, quote, "not as war correspondents, but almost as prisoners of war, not as friends, but as enemies of dangerous character," unquote. As a result, they'd been banned from most of the front lines and only taken to locations specifically chosen in advance by their military escorts. As the short-lived Second War drew to its swift and bloody close, this moratorium on war reporting began to break down, with rumour suddenly becoming fact. A pamphlet published by a pro-Turkish group urged the British public to exercise its opinion against the atrocities and not ignore those committed against Muslims because they had been made by Christians. The pamphlet accused Edward Grey and the government of abandoning any notion of human rights or fairness during the conflict, and treating every complaint made by Balkan Christians as an international emergency. Claims and counterclaims continued to be made during the succeeding decades. Writing in the 1920s on her experience of serving with the Red Cross in Albania, Durham recounted facial mutilation and other gruesome acts being inflicted on Turkish and Albanian POWs by Montenegrin soldiers. She claimed that she had neither seen nor heard of any case of mutilation by Turkish forces. Her allegations were challenged by the novelist Joyce Carey, who had also served in Albania and placed the blame on the hands of Albanian irregulars. Reflecting on the crimes committed by the war's belligerents, the Economist editor Francis W. Hurst, who had been the British representative on the International Commission set up by the Carnegie Endowment, rejected claims that they had been driven by underlying savagery and ancient hatreds. Given the rise of extreme nationalism, Hurst wondered whether it be possible, quote, "that the armies of civilized Europe, even the British Tommy, would vigilantly follow the edict of international law such as the 1899 and 1907 Hague Conventions once the actual tides of war had swept away normal restraints." Okay, I'll summarize it. I'll have to summarize now then. So just to conclude then, when examining the range of opinions and broader public attitudes expressed towards the Macedonian question and the two Balkan Wars, the inclination would be to regard the period in a negative light. Whilst impressions of Macedonia and the region could vary, alter, or occasionally be transformed, they continue to be interpreted through a number of established paradigms from the 1870s to 1913. These paradigms generally involved negative aspects that emphasized the quasi-Asiatic otherness of southeastern Europe. In British imaginings, Macedonia came to encapsulate this otherness, becoming more Balkan than the rest of the Balkans. However, whilst no longer regarded as internationally significant following 1913, the Macedonian question was by no means finished as a feature of British foreign policy. While stressing it as an integral part of its Christian neighbours, the repeat emphasis on Macedonia can be seen as actually placing it apart from them as distinct. Although not akin to recognition of a separate identity, it can be argued that this represented an important period in its formation. Continued denial of such an identity would, strangely enough, lead to its emerging prominence in the coming decades. Thank you.
Благодарам, господине Фостер, за вашата презентация. Ова е еден особено интересен труд, затоа што...
Thank you for your presentation. This is very important presentation because it talks about the views of the British politicians after the German Congress, and as it was shown that neither prior or in between the Balkan Wars, the British policy is ready to accept the distinctness of the Macedonian identity. Even in a later stage, when we ask for allies, they are faced with the fact that they need to respect or acknowledge something that is too evident to hide. Can you make a parallel when it comes to the fighting for freedom of Macedonians and fighting for freedom of the Irish? Because usually, historically seen, we have encountered certain parallels being made when it comes to the fight of the Macedonians for freedom and the fight of the Irish for freedom.
To an extent you can, although historically there are significant differences. For example, what was referred to as the Troubles in Ireland for much of the late 19th and throughout the 20th century, until really the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, were often based quite loosely and only tentatively, but were often based on the notion that Ireland had been an ancient kingdom of some sorts back in the medieval period. In the case of Macedonia, whilst some could argue that that never featured prominently, whilst it did in the argument made by Irish intellectuals and historians. Although, I suppose, in sort of terms of how both struggles were portrayed, you could make comparisons.